Chapter 4: A New Spirituality and the Coming of Christ. The millennium is about many changes, according to the case prophecies: geological, social, political, economic. But in Case's vision, no transformation is more central than a spiritual one. The millennium brings a spiritual renewal. And ultimately, according to his predictions, the millennium is about the return of the Christ Spirit directly into human affairs. This is to be widely experienced and recognized sometime around the beginning of the 21st century. Although there will be signs earlier, those signs of the approaching event will increase in frequency as we near 1998. Among the indicators Case foresaw would be a new movement for cooperation and respect among the world's religions, something that is in fact happening now. But even greater changes lie just ahead. The Case Millennium Prophecies unequivocally state that we are on the threshold of a milestone just as spiritually significant as Christ's physical appearance 2,000 years ago. An event that is predestined and was known even to the spiritual initiates who constructed the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago. Later in this chapter, we will examine the exact nature of these case interpretations of ancient Egyptian prophecy. This second coming will not be a physical birth, as it was with Jesus of Nazareth, but instead an event of more global proportions, in which people of every faith may find a place. It is the drawing of the universal Christ Spirit in direct relationship with anyone who sincerely seeks it. According to the Case Millennium Prophecies, the early signs of this new beginning shall be experienced by a growing number of people in the last years of the 20th century. Prophecies of a second coming. Perhaps no vision of a new age is more dramatic than the possibility of a direct physical interaction of Christ in human affairs, an intervention that would be perceived by all humanity. Nothing better expresses our hope that a new age would include a spiritual renewal for the human family. It is not presented as a certainty in the case readings, nor are there specific details as to timing or appearance. Rather, it is a possibility, perhaps even a likelihood. In the case material on a second coming, several principles are especially noteworthy. He clearly thought of Christ as both a universal spirit that could be seen in all world religions, and as a soul we call Jesus. However, the Christ-like nature of Jesus was attained over many lifetimes of soul development, culminating in Jesus, who became one with the Christ consciousness. In his teachings about the reappearance of Christ, Case indicates that any return will involve this same soul that we call Jesus. When Case was asked in 1932 about the second coming, he flatly stated that no date could be given. It would not occur until his enemies on the earth are wholly in subjection to his will, his powers. That surely sounds like a very high standard for us to meet. Some might even say it's an almost unrealistic expectation for humanity to be anywhere near that state in the foreseeable future. So it's not surprising that the questioner then backed off slightly and asked if this was now a preparation period for a Christ's return. Case responded that it was better understood as a testing period. In another instance, Case was asked by a small group of seekers in 1933 to interpret the biblical passage that the day of the Lord is near at hand. Although his answer was filled with biblical images and poetic phrases, he nevertheless seemed to confirm strongly that the return of Christ is quite possible for our own era. That has been promised through the prophets and the sages of old. The time and half-time has been and is being fulfilled in this day and generation, and that soon there will again appear in the earth that one through whom many will be called to meet those that are preparing the way for his day in the earth. The Lord then will come, even as ye have seen him go." When the group followed up with a request for a time estimate concerning such an event, they were told that it could only happen when those people who are Christ's devoted followers make the way passable and clear for him to come. In other words, there is preparatory work to be done from the human side. The need for efforts to make the way passable is not the result of some inadequacy on the part of Christ. It is not a matter of an inability of Christ to appear in materiality without our help. Instead, we might think of it this way: unless a sufficient portion of humanity lifts itself into a new awareness, then a reappearance of Christ would confuse us or be easily misunderstood by us. Christ will come again only when such an intervention will be truly helpful in the spiritual evolution of which we are a part. It is out of the most profound kind of love that any wide-scale, directly physical appearance of Christ is delayed. Perhaps the most remarkable question and answer exchange about Christ's return took place in 1933. A group of people who were seeking to understand more about the Christ consciousness inquired about the present location of this spiritual being. They even wondered if he might already be on earth in a physical body, but unrecognized. Case's answer was that Christ was not currently in a body in the earth dimension. What's more, if a person needed to have a location for him, it was best to understand it to be in the individual entity, as spirit that can be contacted by anyone who sincerely desires it and who is willing to act in love to make it possible. In other words, we feel the need to know a place where Christ currently resides. It's in a place of spirit that can be contacted as we each go within ourselves. Finally, Case made it clear that he envisioned an actual return, for he shall come as ye have seen him go, in the body he occupied in Galilee, the body that he formed, that was crucified on the cross, that rose from the tomb, that walked by the sea, that appeared to Simon, that appeared to Philip. This is a very straightforward reference to the resurrected body of Christ, reappearing in our own times. Another group of Case prophecies provides a fascinating aspect of his predictions about Christ's return. These predictions are based on Case's perception that hidden prophecies are built into the geometric architecture of the Great Pyramid. To decipher them, Case stated that the central passageway of the Great Pyramid is like a timeline. This timeline corresponds to the ascending passageway and the Grand Gallery passageway leading up to the King's Chamber. Among the pyramid prophecies is the indication of Christ's return at the turn of the new millennium now upon us. What point in history corresponds precisely to move into the special room of spiritual initiation? The King's Chamber? According to the Case prophecies, it was a period from 1938 to 1958. What was to be found in the King's Chamber itself? Only an empty sarcophagus? Case's interpretation of the empty sarcophagus was that humanity would discover that death is not what we've thought it was. In other words, we would awaken to our connections with the spiritual world, and the continuity of life would become an established fact. The interpretation of death will be made plain. One can't help but consider how near-death experience research, started in the 1960s, has radically altered our sense of survival. Interpreting Case's prophecies of a second coming, we may well wonder what kind of an expression of Christ we are to expect. What scenario seems most likely? These readings predict that it will not come in the birth of a baby, as Jesus did 2,000 years ago. The pattern of incarnation by birth has already been established and doesn't need to be repeated. Instead, he will manifest in the very body that he resurrected long ago. having so purified the flesh body and attuned it to the mind and spirit, Jesus the Christ can manifest that body in any plane or dimension at will. There are at least 3 scenarios for his return. One is the spectacular mass appearance, the Christ seen by millions of people in all his glory. In this scenario, the populace of the world is quickly humbled and the Christ reigns in a spiritual and political sense. Many branches of fundamentalism in Christianity expect some version of this scenario, often coupled with cataclysm and punishments to befall the earth just prior to the reappearance. A second hypothesis is that Christ will appear in much the same manner he did just after the first Easter. This scenario involves the direct physical experience of his presence by individuals and small groups. Recall the way in which Jesus ate fish with the disciples in Galilee just after his resurrection. In this case, and in others, he clearly was perceived in a physical way in the outer world. A third possibility is that a return of Christ will be at non-physical inner levels of awareness. Already, there are individuals who claim to have had such a direct experience, and perhaps the second coming implies a dramatic increase in the number of people who experience this. The inner contact via meditation, prayer, dreams, etc. could well be with the resurrected body, mind, and spirit of Jesus who became the Christ. Such a personal contact by millions of people would have a dramatic and uplifting effect on the attitudes and lifestyles of people worldwide. Case is contemporary, the Austrian philosopher and spiritual scientist Dr. Rudolf Steiner predicted a return of Christ that is much like the third scenario. Steiner believed that it was Christ manifesting his purified etheric body that we would expect in our own times. To personally meet the etheric Christ, one would have to make sincere efforts to purify and attune his or her consciousness. That is, to become more spiritually sensitive. In fact, Steiner even offered a date, predicting that these personal encounters with the etheric Christ would start to happen more and more often. Beginning in 1930, not far from the 1936 date that came up several times in case prophecies, there is evidence to suggest that such personal encounters with Christ are on the rise, although they take many forms. Some seem to fit the description hinted at by Case and explicitly described by Steiner as a kind of extended perception into the spiritual world. For example, in Research 1, conducted with Dr. G. Scott Sparrow for a book he later wrote, Witness to His Return, each of us spoke with dozens of individuals for whom the return of Christ was already here, not something still to be awaited. For example, one man shared with me an extraordinary story of his wife's direct experience with Christ just before her death. It seemed that her consciousness had begun to extend into the spiritual world as her physical body neared death. One day, when a friend came over to visit, she suddenly began to talk to people whom her husband and the friend couldn't see. It was as if she was having a party and greeting her guests, but they were invisible to the others. In the room, for some 20 minutes she conversed, speaking and then pausing, listening to the responses. Finally, she began saying goodnight to her guests and thanking them for having come by to visit. As his wife's invisible party came to an end, she announced to her husband and to the friend there in the room, "Oh yes, he was here. He told me I was going to die tomorrow. Isn't that wonderful?" The man knew without a doubt that the reference was to Christ, who had come in this vision to tell her of her imminent passing into the spiritual world. In fact, she passed away at 2 the next morning. Edgar Cayce himself from time to time had visionary experiences of Christ, which fit the third scenario of how Christ's return might manifest. Here is but one example recounted by Cayce in a letter to a friend. Often I have felt, seen, and heard the Master at hand. Just a few days ago I had an experience which I have not even told the folk here. As you say, they are too scary to tell, and we wonder at ourselves when we attempt to put them into words, whether we are to believe our own ears or if others feel we are exaggerating or drawing on our imagination. But to us indeed, they are often that which we feel we hadn't experienced we could not have gone on. The past week I have been quite out of the running, but Wednesday afternoon, when going into my little office or den for the 4:45 meditation, as I knelt by my couch, I had the following experience. First, a light gradually filled the room with a golden glow that seemed to be very exhilarating, putting me in a buoyant state. I felt as if I were being given a healing. Then, as I was about to give the credit to members of our own prayer group who meet at this hour for meditation, as I felt each and every one of them were praying for and with me, he came. He stood before me for a few minutes in all the glory that he must have appeared in to the three on the mount. Like yourself, I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me and rest." Whichever scenario or interpretation of the second coming seems most likely to you, an important factor to keep in mind is the necessity for being open to the new. We must avoid repeating what happened in Jesus' time. Christ will come again only in the spirit of that which is propelling humanity's evolution forward, and hence will appear as something unexpected and new. In Revelation, the birth of a new age, philosopher David Spangler states this beautifully. It is a principle worth keeping in mind as we work to make the way passable for the coming again of the Christ into the physical plane. Spangler asks us to remember that Jesus faced rejection from many of his contemporaries, largely because he didn't fit their expectations of what a Messiah ought to be. Those who spurned him couldn't see the depth and enormity of what he brought to humanity. With this in mind, Spangler warns that the Christ manifestation for this new age could go unrecognized and rejected by many who are thinking of his second coming as a repetition and reinforcement of the past. We are in a new age. The Christ spirit in these times of change. Our ideas of a second coming usually focus on a dramatic scenarios in which this high spiritual being case called Jesus, who became the Christ, returns in such a way that believers and non-believers alike can directly encounter him. But perhaps there are other manifestations of a second coming, not necessarily ones that replace this kind of direct contact, but still broaden the possibilities for how these prophecies will be fulfilled. In fact, we can look at the trends and events around us right now and find among them many hopeful signs, although it's certainly more fashionable to focus on the negative and disturbing side of current events. We can just as readily find indicators that something very good is afoot. Let's consider just a few such movements on the modern scene. In each one we can find key elements of the universal Christ consciousness. As Case's spiritual philosophy defines it, coming to life in extraordinary new ways. Could these be the first signs of the worldwide spiritual revitalization that Case's Millennium Prophecies suggest? Like the first crocuses of March, might these trends be the harbingers of a new sort of planetary culture? If so, then they are every bit as much a part of the second coming as any rematerialization of Jesus. Why? Simply because the return of Christ must this time be to stimulate a fuller expression of the Christ-like ways in human affairs. In Case's estimation, there's no need for a so-called second coming just to bring mankind additional information or teachings. We already received the gospel, the good news about a whole new way of understanding spiritual growth and the redemption of the soul 2,000 years ago, now the cutting edge of any fresh involvement of Christ with humanity must be in the arena of application. The movements described below are simply two examples. Each of us can probably think of other modern events and initiatives that are equally illustrative of the Christ spirit coming into bold new ways of expression. Christ as mediator. One great image of Christ is as the force or impulse that stands between. Case put it this way, referring to the role of Christ: he who stands between those influences of good and evil, the crossroads of choice that every one and every soul each day must cross. Theology has for centuries seen Christ as the redemptive middle ground between the spiritual and the physical, between God and humankind. Case echoes that principle with his assertion that only in Christ do the extremes meet, but all that seems rather far off and abstract when we're confronted by a chaotic and contentious world. Perhaps we sense the need for spiritual redemption, but too many other problems get in the way, particularly struggles with other people. What does Christ as mediator have to do with a landlord-tenant dispute, two state governments bickering over water rights, or a child custody battle between divorcing parents? That's the stuff of which daily life is made. Remarkably, there is indeed a social movement growing very rapidly to bring this consciousness of mediator into human affairs, especially problem solving. It rarely carries with it any kind of religious language, and few, if any, of its practitioners probably think directly of the Christ consciousness as they carry out their challenging work. But if we look carefully at the spirit and the purposes of this movement, we can immediately recognize a new model for human relations, one in which problems are resolved not by force, but instead with mutual respect and the search for common ground. And if we broaden our vision of what a second coming might really mean, if we look at our times with the eyes that the case Millennium Prophecies encourage us to use, then we're likely to see this mediation movement as a direct expression of the Christ spirit, especially in the sense of Christ as a middle way between extreme positions. In this process, parties meet with a trained mediator who assists them in reaching fair, informed decisions to resolve the issues before them. The mediator is not the judge of the conflict. He or she has received extensive training in ways to be an effective bridge and clarifier. The consciousness of the mediator serves as a point where the divergent attitudes, needs, and can meet, and where the parties can explore options in a non-threatening way. Truly, such a person is playing a redemptive role, not as cosmic as the theological one of Christ as Redeemer and middle ground between God and humanity, but nevertheless a powerful expression of how the Christ Spirit comes to life in everyday human events. What does this modern mediation movement have to offer our society, besides being less costly than litigation or warfare? Mediation offers participants a great deal of flexibility in reaching agreements that are tailored to their special circumstances. In addition, mediation can be concluded much more quickly than litigation or armed confrontation, and the parties can avoid the usual hostilities that accompany adversarial court proceedings or international brinkmanship. For family or community relations problems, mediation sessions are usually designed to be informal, private, and voluntary. Unlike litigation, in which the sole objective is to win, mediation emphasizes different goals: communication, understanding, and problem solving. The participants meet with this neutral third party to explore the issues and problems that are important to them. The participants, not the mediator, make the ultimate decisions that will affect their lives. The mediator's role is to skillfully assist the parties in identifying significant issues and needs. Then the mediator leads the parties to a resolution of the conflict by brainstorming options, assessing the implications of each option, and finalizing an agreement. Through the mediation process, participants have the opportunity to create custom-made agreements with provisions that are tailored to meet each individual's needs. It is no surprise that mediated agreements are statistically much more likely to be observed and followed than are court-imposed orders. Moreover, through the mediation process, parties have the added benefit of learning how to communicate constructively with one another, so that their future and ongoing relationship may be less stressful and more productive. Almost any conflict can be mediated, and it's reasonable to hope that in a 21st century culture guided by the Christ Spirit, mediation will become the norm for problem solving in human relations at personal, community, and international levels. Christ in interfaith dialogue. Case's Millennium Prophecies have a deeply ecumenical spirit. Although many of his predictions seem to carry a certain theological slant, after all, he speaks of a return of Christ, not Buddha, Krishna, or Muhammad. The deeper import of his Millennium Prophecies is fundamentally bigger than any single religion. We must recall that he was making these prophetic statements to people who were themselves rooted in a single religious tradition. For the most part, that was a rather conservative Protestant Christianity of the early 20th century in the South. Kay started from that point, then challenged his listeners and us today to a broader vision of what's just ahead. The return of the Christ consciousness directly into human affairs will require a pluralistic vision of faith and spirituality. Here are but two examples of Case's vision of a planetary spirituality that is not limited by the terminology or doctrines of one religion. First, we can look back at an incident in Edgar Case's own life. His work as a professional clairvoyant was not always very successful, at least from a financial standpoint. He depended upon membership dues from individuals who joined his organization in order to get a reading. But there were periods in which requests for readings were meager. At one point in the spring of 1935, Case's supporters asked for a special reading specifically on the question of fundraising. A key concern was how to reach their potential audience. How should Case's work be described? In the very first question they posed for this special reading, they asked if Case's work should be portrayed as direct pronouncements from Christ. Admittedly, for many of us who now look back at that question 60 years later, it seems bold, even a bit presumptuous. However, it was a sincere inquiry on the part of some of Case's most ardent followers. They not only felt that Christ was the source of his inspiration, but that it was crucial to label the readings exactly that way. The answer given that day was a reflection of a more universal and ecumenical spirit. Don't set up limitations. Try to be all things to all people. Meet seekers where they are. To get focused exclusively on a name behind these teachings means to limit interested people who might have personal difficulties with certain terminology. Focus instead on the universality of the Creator. Be ye all things to all men, thereby ye may save the more. For he that declares as a name, in a name, save in the universality of the Father, limits the ability of the seeker. In other words, Case encouraged finding a common ground from which seekers of all persuasions could meet. A second illustration of Case's interfaith ideal is found in the sort of advice he often gave individuals who had adopted too narrow a picture of spirituality. To emphasize the fundamental oneness of humanity's spiritual quest, Case tried to bring his hearers back to basics. There is only one God, no matter what name or label is used. For example, one young woman, a student from Sarah Lawrence College, was reminded, for whether they be Greek, Parthenian, Jew, or Gentile, whether they be of Muhammad, Confucius, or even Shinto, or An, or Mu, the Lord, the God, is one. Of course, Case is only one of many 20th century philosophers, theologians, and creative thinkers who have seen the importance of the ecumenical spirit. Surely the interfaith dialogue that we see in our midst as the millennium approaches is a sign of something extraordinary in human history. Perhaps even part of the blossoming of the universal Christ consciousness. No less a figure than the renowned British historian Arnold Toynbee observed the significance of pluralistic vision, speculating about what might be seen 500 years from now as the most important event of the 20th century. He didn't select the splitting of the atom or the human gene or any war or technological achievement. Rather, he predicted historians of the distant future would recognize as the most significant development of the century a spiritual movement, the meeting of the wisdom traditions of Buddhism and the East with Western Judeo-Christian faith. the Parliament of World Religions held in Chicago in 1993 is surely a sign of this movement. At that meeting, more than 6,500 participants from virtually every religious tradition on the planet gathered to look for common bonds. It was a coming together of East and West, of North and South. One of their central tasks was the shaping of a set of ethical standards that could unite humanity. Not looking for a common set of religious beliefs or devotional practices, they instead focused on the possibility for a mutual acceptable set of behavioral standards in which all men and women could participate for the good of humanity and the earth itself. The declaration of this parliament has been published as a global ethic. In its preamble, this description of the process was offered. As was only to be expected, this declaration provoked vigorous discussion during the parliament. However, the welcome thing is that at a time when so many religions are entangled in political conflicts, indeed bloody wars, representatives of very different religions, great and small, endorsed this declaration with their signatures on behalf of countless believers on this earth. A personal reflection on Christ's return. To come back to a point made earlier in this chapter, there's no need for Christ to return merely to bring additional teachings. We already have the information we need. Our big requirement is to find a way to live in keeping with the spirit of those teachings. The focus of any fresh involvement of Christ with humanity must be in the arena of application. This point was made vivid to me in a profound personal experience many years ago. It came just as I had finished my college education and was contemplating making a commitment to spend my professional career working directly with the case material. It had already touched me deeply with its vision of these special times in which we live, especially in regard to the return of Christ in my own lifetime. I joined 49 other members of the organization that Edgar Cayce had founded many years before his death, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, for a month-long tour of places of spiritual significance throughout Europe and the Middle East. One place that I especially looked forward to visiting was the Great Pyramid. I had carefully read the case material about Jesus and pondered the idea that he had traveled to Egypt for schooling in the esoteric traditions before he began his 3-year ministry. Cayce describes it as a process of spiritual initiation and indicates that Jesus experienced a kind of final initiation in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. And so in my 22-year-old youthful enthusiasm, I was ready to be an initiate too. I was prepared to go to this same spot and hopefully have some sort of transformative experience. Egypt was not the first stop on our tour, so I had plenty of time for the anticipation to build as we traveled. Finally, we arrived in Cairo, and our second day there we took the bus out to the Giza Plateau, just beyond the city. After that 45-minute ride, we arrived at the Great Pyramid. To stand beside it for the first time is an awe-inspiring experience. Although it is not as tall as the other familiar landmarks, such as the Washington Monument, its sheer size and volume is staggering. And the thought that it was built with human labor and archaic tools thousands of years ago defies imagination. The leader of our group gave the official at the entrance a little extra money, which would provide our group with some private time in the king's chamber. The 50 of us went in single file, as mentioned earlier. Much of the climb inside is along an ascending passageway, which slants upward and is so low that you can move through it only in a crouched position. Finally, the structure opens up into the grand gallery, still relatively narrow but with a very high ceiling. The ascent through the grand gallery leads into the king's chamber, a room just the right size for the 50 of us to line the perimeter of the stone room. We all sat down and leaned back against the cool, hard surface. After a short period of discussion from our leader to remind us of the significance of this spot, we had a lengthy group meditation. This was what I had come for. I was hoping for a powerful experience, something mystical perhaps. I knew I wasn't alone in my desires. Most of the group shared my feelings. Unfortunately, I was so excited that I couldn't get still and quiet, and so my meditation time didn't seem very successful. Enthusiasm, ironically, had become an obstacle. When the 20 minutes of silence ended, I was disappointed but nevertheless profoundly impressed by this extraordinary place. We retraced our steps in departing, finally back out in the bright Egyptian sunlight, our guidance announced that we had 2 hours of free time. Among our options were a short walk to the nearby Sphinx, or an equally short walk over to one of the 2 other pyramids nearby. Although I was certainly eager to see the Sphinx, I decided to wait and finish other business first. I had the sense that I had not yet received what I had come to Giza to experience at the Great Pyramid. So while my companions scattered, I walked around to the backside of the Great Pyramid and began to climb its exterior. When it was originally constructed, a smooth limestone sheathing covered the huge stones which layer upon layer created its immense size. But long ago those finishing stones were stripped away, and all that remains are large construction stones that create a step-like appearance when seen up close. It was easy to climb, and within a couple of minutes I was 75 feet up the side. I found a nice shelf about 2 feet by 3 feet, and sat down cross-legged to meditate some more. Rarely in my meditation times had I ever experienced something remarkable. In fact, my special inner experiences had usually been and continue to be in my dreams, especially dreams that came immediately upon falling back asleep after a meditation at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. However, this day, sitting in meditation on the side of the Great Pyramid, something happened. Suddenly I sat in silence with my eyes closed, trying to keep my attention one-pointed. I saw a scene. It was as if I were looking at something that opened up in my forehead. However, it wasn't mystical or transcendent. I saw myself sitting in a business meeting. At the time of this experience, I was only 22 and didn't have a job with any organization, but I did have hopes of someday working for the case organization in Virginia Beach. In this meditation experience, I saw myself in a roundtable business discussion at very headquarters center, and I knew my identity was a staff member. I listened intently as I watched this meeting unfold. I had a strong sense that everyone in the room had the same ideal, but I quickly heard that each person had a different idea about how to get some particular task accomplished. There was argument and some spirited tension. I felt myself being drawn in, and I was about to speak up and lobby for my own point of view. Then unexpectedly I heard a voice in my mind that made me stop and surrender all intentions to get caught up in the argument. The voice began, "Be still." I felt my emotions become free from the entanglements of the business meeting. Then this voice of wisdom went on. The real work of this organization, as it plays its part in this new millennium and the coming again of Christ, is not so much that conferences would be held, books written, or lectures given. As important as those things may be, the real work and purpose is simply this: that a new way of being with each other would be born into the earth. And with those words, I suddenly came back to the normal consciousness, sitting on the side of the Great Pyramid. Undoubtedly, those images and the accompanying words were especially for me, and they've stayed vividly etched in my mind and ideals. Each of us has his or her own way of understanding what the Christ Spirit is all about in these times, and this was my way of catching the vision for myself, but maybe it speaks to others as well. Since that day in 1972, my own career has unfolded in such a way that public speaking and book writing have been central ingredients of my work. Perhaps this inner wisdom, this meditative voice, recognized well in advance that I would have tendencies to overemphasize them from time to time. The form of Christ's work today, be it lectures, books, or anything else, should never blind us from the authentic spirit. And in today's changing world, that spirit is perhaps best described as a new social art, a new way of being present and involved with each other, that more than any other characteristic may be the way we recognize the return of Christ.